Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast. I'm Scott Langdon, your host for this program. And this week on the program, Jerry and Abigail return for another intimate dialogue. On last week's episode, Jerry shared with us what God explained to him about Swadharma, one's personal calling. What do we find when we look more deeply into our own personal calling, the calling only we ourselves can hear and heed? In this week's edition of Jerry and Abigail, an intimate dialogue, the husband and wife philosophical duo share personal stories and reflections on what it means to look deeply into our personal calling and how we relate to God and God to us in the discovery and execution of that calling. Here now are Jerry and Abigail. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello, sweetheart.
Hello.
This week, we're kind of picking up where I left off with my last From God to Jerry to You recording. I was talking about Swadharma. Dharma in India meant one's duty and the norms of social life, largely, and one's duty often defined by role, family relations. You're a wife, you're a husband, you're a father, you owe something to your parents and so on, and to neighbors and so forth, or to stage of life. So the student has a different set of obligations than the retired person who has a kind of spiritual vocation at that point in life. And what drew my attention was the part of the Bhagavad Gita, section 35, that talk about Swadharma. You add that little swa onto dharma, and you get something like self-dharma, one's own personal calling. Mm-hmm. And the passage in the Bhagavad Gita says, better to do your own calling, even if you don't do it well, than somebody else's calling, even if you would know how to do that better. But you've got to follow your own calling. And I think in that recording that I did, I think I quoted you, sweetheart, because I can remember you sometimes say something like, this task has my name on it. Mm. And I remember one context, it was this fight has my name on it. Somebody asked over dinner, you were talking about what you're engaged in. You'd seen an injustice. You were trying to rally people to resist that injustice. And the person at the meal asked, there are many injustices in the world. Why this one, basically? Why? And you just said, this had my name on it, has my name on it. And what does that mean to you? And how do you might say, how do you know? How does it come to you? Could it be a kind of situational? It doesn't seem to be only a kind of deduction from your situation.
What comes to mind to explain my saying such a thing is I tend to look behind me hoping somebody else with a different name can do it better or standing there. And if somebody needs to take up the fight, and to my chagrin, that other person isn't there.
Yeah.
And I'm the only one there who knows about the fight and has some free arms. I could take it up if I put down some other stuff. Then I have to step forward. It's kind of, it's almost invariably very reluctant perception. I remember the Brooklyn College fight to save the then beautiful core curriculum. Few colleges had it. We had it. It was something that allowed the entering student from the interesting multicultural borough of Brooklyn to get immersed in beautiful texts covering a wide range of fields and topics as the introduction to higher education. It was very important, and it also acculturated our incoming students who often came from ports all over the world. And there was a new president who wanted to replace it with a new curriculum focused on the borough of Brooklyn, which was the last thing our students needed to learn about. Usually they knew more than their teachers, and it was not of general use. So I would have loved it if somebody else had been there to take up the cudgels, but there was only a professor in the history department and me. So, we met at the grad center, discussed what we could begin to do to man the fight, if that's the right verb, and also admitted that we both thought we would lose. And I asked my colleague, do you pray? And she said daily. And I said, good, because that's the only thing we got going for us. And we went out, to carry out the fight, in the course of which I happened to meet you, darling, and find love and happiness. But that wasn't why we entered the fight.
Right. No, that was a happy circumstance. I still have the note from the day you called me in my office. I took notes about the issues.
Mm-hmm.
And when I moved offices, I thought, I still have that note from Abigail's first call, and I now have it framed because it was a momentous day in my life that more than I realized, of course, at the moment. And if you ask how it was that I came to be in a role such that you called me and I said, yes, I was running a small higher education nonprofit in Washington, D.C., dedicated to issues of academic excellence and academic freedom and so forth. And someone suggested call Jerry Martin in Washington. And I picked up the phone and we went from there. But if you ask how I got into that role, it's really kind of typical of how I've led my life up until the God experience, when it got a little more strange, you might say. But at any given moment, I've thought, what's the most valuable thing I can do with my life right now?
Mm-hmm.
I've twice given up secure positions, academic tenure once, tenure in the senior level of the civil service the second time. But in each case, I thought, there's something else I can do with my time that seems more important, more valuable, more meaningful to me, maybe in terms of my own priorities and values.
Mm-hmm.
And I often quote this. I don't know if it means anything to anybody else, but the line from T.S. Eliot, where he says, every moment is the moment of death. And death is the moment of a summation of your life.
Yeah.
This is what it comes to. You don't have more chances after that. And every moment is the summation of your life. You're creating its meaning, and that doesn't mean you can't go to the seashore or to the movies or, enjoy a frolic of some kind, because that's also part of a total life. And when you're doing that at the right moments, restoring yourself, then that also is contributing. That's a perfectly fine thing to be doing at your moment of death, if it's part of this balanced life. But at each time, I would always ask, is there something better, in the sense of not happier or more prosperous, but something like more meaningful, more important in the world, not just more important to Jerry, but more important in the world, in reality, of course, as perceived by me through my values and experience. And that's not a bad way to live life. Once I had the God call, then, of course, God's speaking to me. That's very different. And when I pray, I often get this very distinctive answer, often in a voice, not always. Sometimes before the prayer is over, I kind of know what the answer is.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of praying people have that experience. This is not unique to my more intense experience of having received a somewhat full-scale revelation, but any praying person, you pray and you kind of get an answer. You know after you pray what you're to do. Uh,
Mhm.
and and so that's one way to do it. But these I've described my way. You've described what happens with the fight. It's a fight. You don't like to fight. You rather prefer harmony.
Yeah.
And everyone, like to let's all get along,
Yeah.
and have a good time together. Just do our work
Mhm.
and but if they're about to destroy something of immense value to these students, like this wonderful core curriculum is celebrated nationally, uh, then you're going to stand up, even if it looks hopeless. But this Swadharma conception is way more personal than that. And one thing that comes to mind in your life, sweetheart, is you had a kind of what presented itself as a kind of past life experience.
Mm.
And I sometimes feel you write in your column too often about anti-Semitism. But then I remember that vision of a past life experience
Yes.
that seemed to, in part, define your mission in life. Can you just say something about that experience?
Sure. I don't now remember exactly when it came to me, funnily enough, and I don't uh, concretely remember specific incidents that up to a certain point supported the vision. And once the vision had sort of locked in so that it became something I accepted, all those little experiences that pointed me toward it sort of um, sifted down and faded away from my memory. So it's an odd kind of constitutive, self-constituting memory with, you might say, a mind of its own. But the memory goes like this. Um, I'm a young German Jewish woman in the early 1930s. Uh, perhaps Hitler has just come to power. There aren't yet concentration camps, and trucks are used. People are bundled into the backs of trucks, which are then sealed and filled with carbon monoxide, so that it's a rapid mass murder, but it's nothing like the murder factories that were set up later under the expert supervision of Eichmann, I guess Adolf Eichmann above all. Anyway, um, I was in hiding or semi-hiding, staying indoors, not venturing onto the street with some other people who were with me, perhaps family members or friends, German Jews. Somebody must have um, informed on us because one day there was that heavy pounding on the door and in came some kind of military arm of the regime and without ceremony walked us maybe halfway down the block and bundled us into the back of such a truck and sealed the truck and pumped it with carbon monoxide so that without uh, the ability to protest or much delay, we died. And my memory is more of leaving my body and rising up above it to, with curiosity, to try to ascertain just how widespread this murderous hatred of Jews was. And for a while, I was so high that I could see the curve of the planet, but then descended enough to get something like an answer to this question that I was curious to know the answer to. And I saw that it was almost planet-wide. It was very widespread, only having taken concrete form of a plan with an execution in Germany, not because Germany was worse about Jews than other countries, but because it had gone through certain economic, military, and other crises. Its democracy was frail, relatively new. Its social system, its currency, very unstable, very weak. And so it was vulnerable to, it did not have internal resistance. And so it became the focal point for killing Jews. But it was not the only place where that could find support, not at all. And looking at it, planetary wide looking, I remember that I resolved to come back and fight it. And that's odd. I haven't been, like Simon Wiesenthal or some other well-known Nazi hunters engaged in that as a profession, but I have done what I could. My book, I was interested in the philosophic problem of evil. What is evil? Why does it attend human life? How deep is it? Discovered, a bit to my surprise, that there isn't much material on it in the whole history of philosophy. They write about it as if it's the deficiency of good. It's some kind of a defect, whereas I knew it to be a very positive in the sense of internally strong, intelligent, motivated force. And that philosophers had done little about it, had little to say, although they have a love of wisdom and want to understand the constituents of human life. So I set out to write a book about it, in which several chapters are devoted to the Nazi phenomenon. So that's one thing I guess I've done. In the column I now write, I often reference the problem of evil. But I'm not a well-known Nazi hunter or anything like that.
Yeah, but it's in some way defining your life mission. That may be too narrowing a term, but a kind of auspices almost of your life, a kind of backdrop reality and sense of purposefulness. I mean, something important to do to the extent you can do it. It obviously does not crowd out other callings, because we were talking about this other fight that I was alluding to, some injustice that had been in the public press. It had nothing to do with anti-Semitism at all. Another phrase you have used, when we first fell in love, we set the context for that already. You called me and I fell in love with you on the phone. And from that moment, I had not yet laid eyes on you. I just lucked out and that you were so good looking. But I fell in love with you sight unseen. And from that moment on the phone. I was interested in no other woman. They all just dropped out. I was interested in one and only one woman, and then that's defined my life ever since. But at that moment, unfortunately, I don't know, I would have been in bad shape had you not responded to my interest in you. Uh, but in fact, you spoke, it disrupted your life totally. You're a professor in New York City, tenured, great apartment, Upper East Side, the neighborhood you knew, and you lived your life. You know, your father was a professor in Manhattan. And I took you out of all that. I took you out of all that. They took your apartment away. You know, because the rent control and everything, if you're not living there full time, they snatch it from you. Uh, totally disruptive. But in that context, you spoke to me of the necessity of responding to what you called the summons of love. The summons of love. And that's a striking phrase.
It's a funny thing. I don't know if other women friends with whom I've shared a lot of personal life have that particular concept. And I'm not sure how it got itself instilled in me, but I'm far from exemplary practitioner of the arts and drills of being Jewish, but I'm very, a friend of mine said, I have the Jewish essence, I just don't have Jewish existence. Well, all right. But for me, part of the Jewish essence was contained in biblical narratives, and I was early struck by the fact, which forms an essential piece of the biblical narrative in the book of Genesis, that each founder, each patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, each felt that he, or knew that he could not go forward without the right woman at his side.
Remind us, it's Abraham and Sarah.
Abraham and Sarah.
Isaac and who?
Rebecca.
And Rebecca. And
Jacob and Rachel.
Jacob and Rachel.
The romance seemed to me, who was sort of alert to those little phenomena, the romance seemed co-constitutive with the divine voice of their respective callings. And I just noticed that, you know, a little girl wants to know, well, what happens when you grow up? What am I supposed to do since I'm a girl, not a boy? And it seemed to me, I perceived early that these partners to the trio that founded God's call to a covenant were loved women married to the patriarchs who heard the call. And so it seemed to me that this heterosexual, erotic, adhesive was part of the highest spiritual calling that is still grounded in historical experience, that doesn't float upward to merge with the absolute. You could do that too, and I've tried sometimes. I'm not particularly good at mystical merger, but I did give it a go. But I thought, no. My particular angle on life seems to evolve out of and have a linear connection to the Jewish story, the biblical story and post-biblical story on the ground, on the horizontal, with God partnering the story, giving clues, sometimes intervening, but not replacing the story with some kind of strictly sealed off intimacy that has a vertical prior dimension rather than this horizontal one.
But how would you apply that to your first love? I always hate my
Yes.
mind to go there, but
Yeah.
your first love, whom you've written about, which you've written about in your book, Confessions of a Young Philosopher. Now, the
Mm.
first love seems to have been a love, but doesn't quite fit the biblical model of,
Not
of,
exactly.
of
Yeah.
and
Well,
it doesn't fit what you and I now have. It did not seem. I don't know if you would have used the term the summons of love then in that relationship. Maybe you would have.
um, from my parents and the biblical prototypes I've referenced, I got the message that feminine experience is very serious, very consequential, and significant in its own right. In the Anglo-American, let's say broadly, a culture in which, being born here, I was raised, that did not seem to enter in adolescence, girls who could be tomboys and uh, act um, like one of the gang and not overdo the feminine part were valued. And those ideas, um, which I had picked up early, were not entertained. Nobody spoke about them as positive. Femininity itself was, I don't know if anybody talked about it. Uh, there were novels you read, they had to do with big sex breakthrough, D.H. Lawrence, Hemingway, The Earth Moved, but they didn't value as such femininity. And I didn't know where else to go to find it, but there were European women who modeled it in my period of growing up. So I knew it was real. Now, when I had this Fulbright grant to Paris, it was clear that the feminine was highly valued. And in a sense, I felt at home there for that reason, as many of my fellow Fulbright women did not. They felt out of place, but I recognized what was going on, though the French myth about Tristan and Isolde, where they don't live in history, they live in impossible romance, was different from the biblical model, but it was it was at least a fraction of what I had grown up believing in. So that when I met this young Greek philosophy student and he went through some of the steps of courtship that I had known about from my childhood and these European women who modeled femininity for me, I responded that he meant seduction, that seduction was dangerous, that he meant that he was a communist, that he had values that were antithetical to the commonly known ones, it was as if it started right and went off track. But by the time it went off track, I had been already something that couldn't happen to a young American girl, seduced, half with physical force. And I didn't know how I got there, but I knew it was intensely dangerous. At the same time, it contained some of the fragments of the ideal I had taken seriously, and he seemed, and perhaps did, for that season, which in the French view is always, by that time, brief. There's a brief season for the stroke of lightning, for the sudden impact of violent, all-encompassing romance.
So love comes and then quickly goes.
It goes. Yeah, it goes. In the model, Tristan and Isolde, they both die. These medieval lovers. Dante and Beatrice don't have any relationship on Earth. Romeo and Juliet both die. So these violent, all imperative, demanding, romantic strokes of lightning are allowed to happen, but they are not allowed a historical future. So I was
in the French culture, French erotic
culture, and perhaps European romantic model has this in varying degrees. You think of Dante, he doesn't marry Beatrice, they're both married elsewhere. They will live together in heaven after they die. The English Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, they don't live. They don't have to face, his parents, her parents. They don't have to negotiate with two families who are not getting along. They don't have to do real things. They simply have an overwhelming passion for each other, which they both live to its demise, to its tragic ending. So on the one hand, I thought the Europeans are right to take romantic love with full seriousness, but they can't be right to make it unlivable in history. The Anglo-Americans that I knew of were wrong to deny that there is such a thing, though they do live pragmatically on the plane of real life. So I found myself neither in one cultural milieu comfortable nor in the other, and sort of dancing on the head of a pin in the aftermath of this romantic.
So it was an unsuccessful love in the sense he was not really worthy of you, is how I would see it. Mm-hmm. And you, of course, moved on because you're not a fool. You were in love. You felt all of that, but you're not a fool either. And you were back in the States at a certain point. You didn't hear from him again. There's a little more to the story than that. One of the things you've often said, sweetheart, is that you did not become cynical. You didn't think, this love stuff, you've just given a kind of critique of this French version of romantic love that's just a bolt from the sky and can't be lived out in real time in life. That just sounds like, oh, well, big mistake. People, men are all cads, that kind of thing. And just give that up. Or you settle down. You just think, oh, well, I'll just marry a guy who will bring in an income or maybe be an appropriate father for my children or something like that. You just make a pragmatic decision. But you've always told me that you kept the romantic quest alive in your own life, even as years went by.
Yes. Well, I'm both a philosopher, a person on a quest to understand life, to perceive and get hold of as much wisdom as life allows, a real life allows, and at the same time, a woman. So that combo doesn't have a lot of recognition. There are people like, say, Augustine is a classic case of a confession where it's a man taking his life as the occasion for the research into the meaning of life. And he won't quit until he's got an answer. And for him, the answer will be to become a founding father of Christianity. So I also wanted an answer to the question of the meaning of life, but I was a woman. And so the question would have a very different context. And the context of real life. And in that context, if the person asking the question, the Augustinian question, what is life all about? Never mind, what I could do to make $1, what I could do to get by, what I could do to cope with all my weaknesses and mask them adequately and become a success. Those were not the defining questions for my life. The defining question was and is what is life, a human life, about? How do you best live a human life, wherever you're positioned to live it? And the one asking the question in this case was not a man like Augustine, it was a woman like me. And so the constraints, the disadvantages, the ladder to climb was quite different from his. And one of the differences was if I was motivated and to some extent perhaps gifted to be a philosopher, to work in that field, that wonderful love of wisdom field, how did a woman proceed? And the answer I was given in the department, which seemed most interesting to me at Penn State, was you proceed as if you weren't a woman and you need to destroy your femininity. That was said to me openly by the Straussian, who was perhaps the most interesting member of that department. And I didn't resent his saying what he obviously believed, but I couldn't honestly agree with him because I had these other models, the European women who were not philosophers, but were good at being women, as if there was an art to it. They were good at it. I knew you could flunk Womanhood 101, but they didn't. And then this European model, and also in a very different register, biblical model, a woman was very important in life. If she played it right, if she played her hand that she was dealt right, the very feminine presence could be of utmost importance. But I didn't have a way of putting those ingredients together. It was not, there was no model that put it all together. There was Jane Austen, but what she was supposed to do with that was make an advantageous marriage or not, remain a spinster. And I don't know, there was the Bronte sisters, but that seemed a rather special case. They didn't pose the question in the same way, and you couldn't replicate their particular romantic lives. I didn't see somebody who had posed the question as worth posing and then had gone forward to try one thing after another. And when the feminists came along at a later point in American and European history, what I knew of their personal lives, their personal lives were a disaster. Their personal lives were flops. I mean, I won't go into gossip, but I knew enough of these women to know, no, they've got a masthead and they run up a flag, but they haven't solved it themselves. And de Beauvoir, who wrote the, second wave classic, The Second Sex, she only said that a woman was a sort of social, femininity was a social contrivance, something made up, and you could make, she had from Sartre, her true love, the idea that you could make yourself up. Her personal story was less liberated than that of any woman I know personally. Her personal story was a disaster. So I didn't have a model or a rationale for this pilgrimage toward a resolution, a resolved answer to the question, how should one live one's life as a woman?
I mean, it sounds as though there's a kind of romantic sense of direction to life,
Yeah.
and a feminine sense of direction to life.
Yeah.
And I don't know what else. There are other elements you've talked about. You become a philosopher, so there are other elements in one's life than these two. But you don't discount that romantic urge, and yet you're fully aware of its dangers.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of the drama of a person's life, and especially perhaps of a woman's life, because of its vulnerabilities and so on.
The vulnerabilities are defining the lie, the mensonge, the deception in de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, is that by thinking differently, you can be less vulnerable. Oh, no. No, 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 no. I remember I'm on 86th and Lexington, and I see a girl waiting for the bus to cross town. It's night. She's wearing a really short skirt and maybe fashionable boots, and she's asking me, I cross the street, she's a foreigner, she's English. Is this the way to go to the West Side? I say, yes. And then she says, is this the right skirt for New York? I said, it's a little short, honey. You know, it's a little short for New York at night.
Yeah.
You know, the vulnerability, no, there's no pretending otherwise. Hell, you can get pregnant, you can get knocked up. What are they talking about? Free sex. It ain't free. It's very expensive. And it's different for a woman than a man. And what was a disaster worth considering, drowning myself, the loss of virginity, then, now, if you haven't, if you're carrying virginity into your 20s, that's supposed to be a disaster. Listen, you can't win. These are not good frames for a woman trying to figure out trying to ask and answer the question, within what frames can I and should I live meaningfully so that my life is not a mess, is not something I regret.
Is there some general answer to that question, or is it a question for each woman simply to navigate through her own life?
Well, one helpful feature, which I don't think we have as yet, would be to clear away some of the misleading pseudo encouragements. There's no difference between a woman and a man. There's no reason for modesty, for privacy in the bathroom, in the bedroom where you sleep, where you get in the shower. No difference, just get in there and keep punching, little fella. No, there's a hell of a lot of difference. You can get pregnant, you can get raped. You have a shorter period for having children than a man does. You are still on the receiving end of sexual preference. You can't strong arm a man into an erotic relationship, above all, not one that is protective of you. If you get left, you're more kind of likely to feel more used than a man might. Women much younger than me tell me that the fate of a woman, of this woman, my story, deployed in Confessions of a Young Philosopher, draws recognition from much younger women. I suspect that if you cleared a lot of myths away, a lot of fashionable misunderstandings away, it would be a darn sight easier to make your way as a woman than it is today.
Yeah. And you often report, after conversations with women younger than you, a kind of confirmation that what women across the generations and eons, you might say, really want is love from the right love.
Yeah.
And love with commitment, like marriage and so forth. Because not fly-by-night love, but love with commitment and with caring, and as you know, I practically think the woman deserves to be worshipped. You find the right woman, and it's the best thing that can happen in your life, and you shouldn't let it slip by and slip out of your grasps. A lot of men have a good woman and take her for granted, or even wander around, as if they're in a field of daisies or something, and you can just go pick flowers. But no, it's more serious than that. And if you have the right woman for you, like hang on to her, do everything to make her understand and feel daily that you love her, And as I say, practically worship her. Well, you don't have to be as gaga as Jerry happens to be, but it is a kind of ultimate value in one's life. The totally different. Live a loveless life, a life alone, or a life with someone you love. What a difference. That's everything. That's everything.
Yeah, it is everything. And I come back to the biblical model. These three founders of what will be a covenantal relation with God through time, through chronological history, not a history with, fireworks, but step by step by step. Yesterday is earlier than today. Tomorrow will be later. That history, chronology. What are you doing with your time? Is God an influence, a factor? How are you making sense of your time? Where are you? Those three patriarchal founders of the covenantal relationship, each one, before he can get started, or as a condition of his life, has to have the right woman. That seems to me better than Tristan and Isolde or Dante and Beatrice, all of which do not live step by step in chronological time. Hamlet and Ophelia. No, Mr. Prince of Denmark, marry the girl. Stop being horrible. Maybe she can help you. She's not that stupid. Maybe she can figure something out about who killed the king and so forth. I think a lot of people feel this and think this, and it's unsayable. It's taboo. It's considered foolish, romantic and foolish. It's intelligent. There's emotional intelligence here. And if it's peculiar to one culture or some rare moments in a culture, it doesn't have to be. There are lots of things that we have from one culture that we don't feel shy about saying, hey, I can use a bit of that. Coffee, we have it from Vienna, which got it from its mortal enemies, the feared opponents. Hey, it's great. I wouldn't be without it. Coffee. So true love, it's as good as coffee. I recommend it.
Well, you often tell me I don't drink coffee. I don't like the taste or the smell. So I'm unusual. But you often tell me coffee is the meaning of life. So that's one element. In fact, to be enjoyed, to be prized, to be given its place in one's life.
Oh, it's a beautiful thing.
Maybe on the wonderful meaning of coffee is a good place to conclude. And we all agree to that proposition. So,
in varying degrees, yeah.
So thank you very much, sweetheart.
Thank you, darling.
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com and always at godandautobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@godandautobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective, as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.